Quest. I am, if you're not familiar with me, I am Dr. John Helwig. I am the Dean of Student Life here at Concordia Lutheran Seminary. And I welcome you here, welcome you back. For this, our president, Dr. Jim Gimbel, sends his greetings. He is unfortunately unable to be here because he has not mastered being in two places at once. He is presently actually in Winnipeg for meeting with the council presidents for the placement of our candidates and vicars. And, it's actually an exciting time for us, as it is anyway at this time of year, but this year we're going to be having three pastoral candidates placed as new pastors in the church. We also have a diaconal student who was going to be placed as well, and 5 vicars. So it's it's a good time for us. And that said, though, actually there's more requests for candidates and vicars right now than we have students. So he's presently in the midst of all of those discussions, trying to figure out who goes where and what best fits up in that. So he sends his greetings. It's a pleasure to have you with us, both those of you who are here locally and those who are here online. As we continue these Quest programs, it's just a free offering that we give to the church for the good of the church. And if you're interested, it usually takes a couple of days, but this will also be posted online on YouTube, on the seminary YouTube channel. So if you're talking to somebody and go, oh man, I wish I could have seen that, and they can watch it. And the good news is while it takes us a couple of days, they can still hopefully see it prior to next week. So if there's somebody here who wants to tune in next week, but I missed the first part of it, they can see it online and then be all caught up for next week as well. The schedule is a little bit off this year, just trying to get things worked out here. Although we've been kind of joking around the faculty and staff here because this is normally our winter quest. The weather is acting like it's still winter even though the calendar says otherwise. So we've been kind of joking that maybe we should call this the spring quest and hopefully get the weather to come in line. But
What's spring quest?
Yeah, that's what I call it.
So we're hopeful here. So anyway, the program today, we have back again with us Dr. John Maxfield, who is the resident here, local Luther Scholar. He's a local Luther Scholar. You might recall that just last year he had a book that he edited, released, Defending Luther's Reformation. And he was also our guest, as many of you recall, in the fall. And in the fall, it was Luther's road to the Reformation, kind of bringing him up to the point of truly becoming a reformer. Early on, Luther was not really intending to be a reformer, did not see himself as not acting as a reformer as he saw it. So now, because we got very positive responses and it has an excellent program last time, we've asked Dr. Maxfield to come back to continue the story now. And this time, as you can see, it's from Luther's Reform to the Reformation. So now we're actually moving into the actual, ultimately into the actual Reformation. So I will turn it over to Dr. Maxfield. Thank you.
Greetings, and thank you for that introduction, John, and thank you all for being here. And hello to the folks out in internet land. So, for those of you who were with us last fall, we talked about Luther's development into becoming a reformer. And I mentioned that the Reformation, though, we can say it began, in a sense, with the posting of the 95 Theses in 1517, October 1517. I emphasize that the Reformation really doesn't begin until several years later, and indeed when Luther's not even present in Wittenberg, but is actually in exile. And that's where we'll take off tonight. But after we visit first where we left off last time. We we're at the Diet of Worms. We heard how Luther had to confront the empire, the emperor, the newly elected Emperor Charles V, just 21 years old, didn't speak hardly a word of German, grew up in the lowlands or the Netherlands area in a French-speaking court, was also king of Spain, Charles I of Spain. So I think he knew Spanish quite well, but very little German. And we left off where Luther was demanded that he recant his positions that had led to his excommunication by the church, and he refused to do so with his famous speech, often called his "Here I Stand" speech. And that's where we're going to start again. I think if I remember right, we watched a YouTube clip of the old Luther movie last time. Did we do that? The black and white film with Luther. I often do that, and I can't remember if we actually got that into the course or if I just told the story. But I want to start tonight with the same clip, the same speech, but from a different movie. The 2003, I believe it was, movie Luther, that starred Joseph Fiennes, I guess you pronounce his name that way, as Luther, and begin with a look at his "Here I Stand" speech. But before we do that, just mention a couple things. I recommended last time a few reading things that can accompany you in this course. A fairly new biography of Luther, Martin Luther, Visionary Reformer by Scott Hendricks, published in 2015 by Scott Hendricks. Very fine biography which will accompany also the material we're covering in this class. Most biographies of Luther will also be histories of the early Reformation because the two were inseparable. The Roman Catholic Luther scholar or Reformation scholar Joseph Lortz once wrote, "Martin Luther was the Reformation." And in many ways that's true, although we will also see that there were other actors in the drama that are very significant, and even disagreement becomes significant early on in the Reformation. But Luther, of course, is a major figure, the major figure, I think, of the 16th century, certainly of the Reformation. So every good biography of Luther will also introduce you to the Reformation as a movement. And then I mentioned also last time Scott Hendricks' short Theology of Luther that also would accompany this material quite well in terms of looking at the development of his insights as a theologian. Together with an edition of Martin Luther's works, I used selections from his writings, edited by John Dillenberger, an older publication but still available and usually cheaply on Amazon or wherever. And I'll refer to some of those writings during the course of these lectures. And then I wanted to mention another book that is a more recent book. Well, not that recent, but 1992 it came out, but one that really talks about the Reformation as a social movement, as something beyond Wittenberg and how it got moving. A book by a scholar trained at Harvard, or teaches at Harvard University, Stephen Osmond, called "Protestants' Birth, the Birth of a Revolution." It's very interesting and I think very accessible look at how the Reformation became a movement that had a great appeal, and the activities of other people besides major reformers like Luther to bring about the spread of the Reformation. Way back in 1975, Osmond published a book called "The Reformation in the Cities" that had that same theme, a little more scholarly a text as opposed to a very accessible text as this later one, that was one of the first works to really talk about how and why Luther's message was so appealing in Germany, in the empire, in the early 16th century. And so we'll want to touch on some of those themes this time as well. So, from Luther's Reform to the Reformation, we're looking at one decade, 1521 to 1530. Anybody have an idea why would I use 1530 as a significant date for the Lutheran Reformation? It will actually be the next diet of the empire when Charles V is present, from Worms in 1521 to the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. Charles is busy taking care of things in Spain and fighting wars in Italy and in France. Doesn't come back into Germany until the Reformation is a big thing going on. And he comes back for the German Diet in 1530 to try to push for a restoration of the unity of the church. And that is when the Lutheran supporters of Luther's reform, many of them very important electors and nobles of the empire, presented the Augsburg Confession. So we look at that as kind of in a way, the formal beginning of the Lutheran Church as a church, in a way, as a confession, distinct in its own way. And so that's the window we look at for the early Reformation, this decade of the 1520s. So what I want to do now is look at this clip from Luther at the Diet of Worms. And I want you to look carefully at the way it's presented. Of course, it's a major motion picture, so historical accuracy is always a question. But I want you to try to understand this scene where Luther is asked or demanded that he recant his writings, his views that have led already to his excommunication, condemnation by the church. And I want you to observe as closely as you can what happens, both in his speech and immediately after. And I'm going to talk about that briefly afterwards. So let's try see how well we can follow this. And maybe it'll be good to just turn down the lights a little. I don't know how that will affect your cameras.
By the door.
Okay.
You're right. I think I can get it.
Order in the hall. Order. Order. Martin Luther, are you the author of these writings?
I am.
Do you recant what you have written here?
I cannot renounce all of my works because they are not all the same. First are those books in which I have described Christian faith and life, so simply that even my opponents have admitted that these works are useful. To renounce these writings would be unthinkable, for that would be to renounce accepted Christian truths.
He is not here to make speeches, only to answer.
The second group of my work is directed against the foul doctrine and evil living of the popes, past and present.
No! Through the laws of the Pope and the doctrines of men, the consciences of the faithful have been miserably vexed and flayed.
If I recant these books, I will do nothing but add strength to tyranny and open not just the windows but also the doors to this great ungodliness.
He has condemned himself.
In the third group, I have written against private persons and individuals who uphold Roman tyranny and have attacked my own efforts to encourage piety to Christ. I confess that I've written too harshly. I am but a man and I can err. Only let my errors be proven by Scripture. And I will revoke my work and throw my books into the fire.
You have not answered the question. You, Martin Luther, will not draw into doubt those things which the Catholic Church has judged already. Things that have passed into usage, rite, and observance. The faith that Christ, the most perfect lawgiver, ordained. The faith the martyrs strengthened with their blood. You wait in vain for a disputation over things that you are obligated to believe. Now give your answer. Yes or no?
Will you recant or will you not? Since your Majesty and your Lordships desire a simple reply, I will answer. Unless I am convinced by Scripture and by plain reason, and not by popes and councils who have so often contradicted themselves. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. To go against conscience is neither right nor safe. I cannot, and I will not, recant. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me.
You can just hold it right there. That's fine. Yep. So, what did you see? What is the scene? We have Luther's speech, of course, but what's the context of the speech?
They had supporters that were, behind him and encouraging him.
Mm-hmm. Probably, it was I think the records hold that it was a fairly small room. They purposely had a small room for so not a large crowd, but there would have been people there observing. I think it said that this was the first, if not the only time that actually the elector Frederick and Luther saw each other. They had been in touch through Luther's or the elector's secretary Spalatin quite frequently before and after this event, and possibly I have to do some more homework on this. Possibly later Luther may have met him, but I don't think so. But up until this time, the elector has been protecting Luther, but at a cautious distance, and even doesn't endorse the changes that we'll begin to that began to happen, that we'll begin to talk about tonight. But he was there, and he's portrayed there, obviously observing very carefully what's going on. What else did you see?
Well, I would say from the and this could just be the portrayal that's on the movie itself, but the look on the faces of both Charles and I'm not sure who the other fellow was.
Aleander, the major papal legate.
They weren't sure.
The guy in the red.
Yeah, what to think. from the start, they're on the offensive, but when they see that Luther has some support from whoever's shouting outside or whatever, they're not sure what exactly they think. So I think fear, perhaps, from that side.
Yeah, and that's actually why I wanted to begin with this clip, is this portrayal of the immediate aftermath of Luther's speech. Whether or not it's historically accurate, I have no idea in terms of whether that was a dynamic, but we do know that Luther had a great deal of support in the city of Worms, and that in the aftermath of Luther's speech, even what was called the Bundschuh, the Bundschuh, the symbol of the peasants.
Forgot about that. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay. The Bundschuh was a symbol. It was a peasant's boot. It was a symbol of the peasants when they gathered, threatening uprising. And peasant uprisings had become more frequent toward the end of the 15th century, early 16th century. It was quite often on the mind of the empire and the nobles, the princes, of keeping the common man satisfied in a very unsatisfying economic and feudal life, and constant nervousness about of peasant uprisings, and the knowledge that Luther had quite a following. On the way to Worms, Luther had preached in his old university town of Erfurt to very large crowds of people. And so though he went essentially as a defendant to the, basically knowing that he would be condemned if he would not recant at the Diet of the Empire, he knew that he had supporters. And that is a very effective portrayal, whether the actual details are historically accurate or not. It portrays something very important, that what would happen in Luther's defiance, his refusal to recant, and what actions would or could be taken against him. Normally, a condemned heretic would be handed over to the civil power to be executed. And this had happened to the reformer, the Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, 100 years before. He had been called to the Diet of the Empire in a meeting in Constance. And he was given, as Luther was later, a safe conduct, imperial safe conduct, the guarantee of his safety. But that safe conduct was not honored. He was arrested at the Diet of, or at the council, excuse me, not a Diet of the Empire, but a council of the church in Constance, and was executed by burning, so about 100 years before Luther. And that's pretty much what people expected to happen to Luther. He was granted a safe conduct. This time it was honored. He was permitted to return home. But as we will see, the Diet was to act now and did not see itself as free to not act in condemnation of Luther, since the church had already spoken its excommunication, and Luther now had refused once again to recant or withdraw his positions. We okay? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we, we're going to look at Luther at the Diet of Worms now, the aftermath, what happened, his exile, and then a look at the beginnings of reform from Luther's exile tonight. So if we go to the next slide, what happens in the immediately after Luther's speech, refusal to recant. I think I mentioned last time, but for those who weren't here, or maybe everybody forgot, it's debated by historians whether the words "Here I stand" are in the speech. It was certainly published as part of his speech immediately. The first accounts do include those words. But the minutes and the official records of the Diet omit just that phrase, "Here I stand." It just ends his, "I refuse to recant, God help me, amen," is the end of the speech according to the minutes of the Diet. But as a matter of fact, that is what he did. He stood his ground now in the face of the empire, the emperor, just as he had in the face of the condemnation of the church, which had happened that previous January. This again was April 1521. Mid-April, I think it was the 18th and the 19th of April that Luther stood before the Diet. And the next day, if we can go to the next slide, Charles, the newly, emperor, young man, 21 years old, gives his response. Click ahead, please. Right away, Charles responded to the electors of the empire and the princes with a speech of his own. Next, please. I am descended from a long line of Christian emperors of this noble German nation and of the Catholic kings of Spain, he spoke. These were all faithful to the death to the Church of Rome, and they defended the Catholic faith and the honor of God. I have resolved to follow in their steps. A single friar who goes counter to all Christianity for 1,000 years must be wrong. Therefore I am resolved to stake my lands, my friends, my body, my blood, my life, and my soul. Not only I, but you of this noble German nation would be forever disgraced if by our negligence not only heresy, but the very suspicion of heresy were to survive. After having heard yesterday the obstinate defense of Luther, I regret that I have so long delayed in proceeding against him and his false teaching. I will have no more to do with him. I will proceed against him as a notorious heretic and ask you to declare yourselves as you promised me. So immediately, the day after Luther's speech, Charles' response became clear, and that set into motion a series of meetings at the Diet as to how the Diet officially would respond as a government to Luther's stance. And there was a delay. Indeed, not until, are we in the next slide, please? Not until the 6th of May was it dated, and therefore already written, but not signed and issued till May 26th, the official response of the Diet called the Edict of Worms, which issued against Luther. It's clear that Charles hesitated due to that popular support of Luther that he saw, that he witnessed at various levels, also within the officials of the Diet. And so there is this delay, but on May 25th, Charles read the edict before a gathering. By that time, only 4 of the 7 electors still remained at the Diet. Others were starting to go home. Many of the other German estates and their representatives had started leaving the Diet. This is a sign of a lack of support for what they believe is going to be the majority decision against Luther. And so they leave, probably in protest or just in frustration. And so, as a matter of fact, it's issued not in the name of the Diet as a whole, but rather in the name of the Emperor, Charles V, the Edict of Worms, published then the following day on May 26th. The Edict of Worms was a strong statement condemning Luther and all who would follow his teaching. Next slide, please. It stated, Luther has sullied marriage, disparaged confession, denied the real presence of the Lord in the sacrament. He is pagan in his denial of free will. The devil in the habit of a monk has brought together ancient errors into one stinking puddle and has invented new ones. His teaching makes for rebellion, division, war, murder, robbery, arson, and the collapse of Christendom. He lives the life of a beast. He has burned the decretals. Remember, he had done that, burned the threat of his excommunication, various decrees, including copies of canon law in December of 1520, the previous December. He despises alike the ban and the sword, that is, the church's authority and the empire's authority. He does more harm to the civil than to the ecclesiastical power. We have labored with him, but he recognizes only the authority of Scripture. We have given him 21 days, dated from April 15th. We have now gathered the estates. Luther is to be regarded as a convicted heretic. When the time is up, no one is to harbor him. His followers are to be condemned. His books are to be eradicated from the memory of man. So clearly a forceful act of law, declaring Luther formally an outlaw. That was the term used. It meant outside the law. Anyone could kill Luther and suffer no penalty of law because he was outside the law. And it was expected that he would eventually be arrested and executed. They did proceed to, next slide please, to burn Luther's books in Worms. Just as after his excommunication, there had been several book burnings in different parts of the empire. But also it became clear right in Worms that there was a lot of opposition to this official act of the Diet. And again, that fateful sign, the Bundschuh, appeared and this is what it looked like, a peasant's boot. And here's a peasant with a banner, battle flag essentially. Signs of unrest and organization against the authorities by the common man, as was common, as they were often called, the peasants, and also the commoners of the towns would often act in concert in opposition to authority when they grew displeased with various acts of law or violence. So according to the Edict of Worms, we can go to the next slide, Luther had these 21 days to reconsider, but you may notice dated just before his actual speech in the middle of April. But after the edict was published, it essentially became a worthless piece of paper in a way. In other words, it was simply unenforceable. The edict very clearly called for Luther's condemnation and the condemnation of any who would follow him. But even the Elector Frederick the Wise and several other very important powers of the empire themselves began simply to refuse to enforce the law. And this became a political situation for the whole decade, that law against Luther and any following of Luther continued to be resisted or simply unenforced, and the Reformation began to grow as a popular and social movement, as well as a movement of reformers, scholars like Luther and others, pastors, theologians, in many cases with the support of local and territorial leaders and very powerful people in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and as we'll see, also outside that political community. Again, I mentioned that Charles V, after the Diet, went back to Spain to take care of his realm there, and there was a lot of things that he needed to deal with there. And the 1520s occupied him with quite a few matters, and did not return to the Diets of the Empire, which generally meet every year until the end of the decade, 1530. On the way back home to Wittenberg from Worms, Luther wrote a final letter of appeal to the emperor as he passed Frankfurt on Main, but there's no record that Charles ever answered Luther's personal communication to him. Also on the way home to Wittenberg, next slide please, on the way home he stopped in Eisenach and preached a sermon in the local church to a gathering, so continued support for Luther was evident even on his journey home after his condemnation. And then just outside this town of Eisenach, where Luther had gone to school for a short time as a child, remember? Next slide, please. Luther was kidnapped. an abduction. And it turns out it was by agents of Frederick the Wise. He knew in advance, apparently, that this was going to happen, or at least at some point he knew. But not even the elector himself or his brother, Elector John, were informed as to where his own agents were going to take Luther. But it was effectively Luther being placed in exile, protective exile we might call it, inside the territories of Saxony somewhere, where he could be under the protection of his prince. And it turned out that that was at one of the fortress castles of the elector, overlooking the town of Eisenach, the Wartburg it's called. So here's a rather dramatic portrayal of the kidnapping, the abduction of Luther, apparently at night as he's riding with just a few people protecting him, and he is taken to this exile at the Wartburg. And there's just a whole number of slides we can go through fairly quickly, just to give idea of this place. It's been beautifully restored in recent years. Historically, the Wartburg may show you more, especially its interior, about 19th century views of Luther as a great German hero than it looked in his own day, because it was deeply restored and developed as a place in the 19th century. But nevertheless, it's an important site for Luther's life. He spent the next 10 months there from May until March of the following year, 1522, in this place he called the Kingdom of the Birds. He was pretty much alone. There was a caretaker of the castle. There sometimes gathered a community of people. He even preached occasionally to a group of people. But especially at first, he was pretty alone. We'll learn he sometimes struggled with some illness at the time. But he spent the next 10 months of his life there at the Wartburg. Let's go through the next several. We'll stop at this one. So, what had happened to Luther, people didn't know. The very famous artist, Northern Renaissance artist from Nuremberg, Albrecht Dürer, by this time had known of Luther and had put a lot of stock in his proposals for reform. And Dürer wrote in his diary, "I know not whether he lives or is murdered, but in any case he has suffered for the Christian truth. If we lose this man, may God grant his spirit to another. His books should be held in great honor and not be burned as the emperor commands. O God, if Luther is dead, who will henceforth explain to us the gospel? What might he not have written for us in the next 10 or 20 years?" And we can move forward. I'm not sure how many. Well, there's. Stay there. Go back one if you can. So they just put a lot of money into all the Lutheran sites the last few years in Germany. So it looks quite good these days. Of course, he went there in May, and so had a number of months of fairer German weather. But the next slide shows what this place might have looked like in the winter time. Luther did spend through the next winter at the Wartburg. Go ahead. Again, it overlooks a still very rural area, but also the small town of Eisenach. And so you get a sense of a very isolated place. Again, Luther calls it the Kingdom of the Birds. And this is the window that goes into the room where Luther eventually set up a study and began working during his time in exile. Inside that window, you have this room, and you still today can look through this door at Luther's desk, at least as it's been presented. I would imagine it's not original furniture to Luther's time. This is the way it looked for a while from an old picture, with a lot of clutter, many paintings and things from much later in Luther's life. His mother and father, quite old. I think those are paintings of Luther's friend Lucas Cranach from around 1530, just before Luther's father died there. Next slide. For a long time on the desk has been Luther's German New Testament. We'll talk about that. This is the way it pretty much looks today, a much simpler scene with a portrayal with some paintings. I think it's of Elector Frederick and Luther's Junker Jörg. We'll also talk about that. Go ahead. Yeah, it's actually Luther and his colleague Philip Melanchthon, and then above Luther with a beard. Luther is Junker Jörg. Okay? So, in other words, in exile, Luther essentially takes on a disguise. He is kept rather almost like a custody, although he could go and does leave at times. Even visits Wittenberg, as we'll learn, the following December. But by that time, Luther has abandoned the tonsure of a friar, grown out his beard. He is Junker Jörg, that means Knight George, and he essentially is appearing as a knight, as a horseman and soldier. And this is the way he styles himself during the next several months after he's grown out his beard. Okay? So this becomes, however, a very productive exile. And it really is, I think, the beginning of the Reformation. Luther is not present in Wittenberg, as we'll see things begin to happen, but he is corresponding constantly with his supporters in Wittenberg, with the secretary of Elector Frederick the Wise, a guy by the name of George Spalatin, which he had known probably back in university days, and they were rather close friends. As one of his most important correspondents for many years was Spalatin. Luther is answering letters that detail what's going on at home, also on theological issues. His colleague at Karlstadt writes a series of theses against clerical celibacy, saying that it's a sin if clergy don't marry, it's a sin if monks don't leave the monasteries, etc. Begins to make arguments that Luther has started making, but now making them in a more more demanding action, demanding actual changes in response to the things that Luther had been writing about throughout the period leading up to his stand at Worms. We have letters, a very interesting letter of November, where Luther writes to Spalatin, and he says, you need to have Melanchthon, Philip Melanchthon, his colleague at the university, teacher of Greek, brilliant young humanist scholar, just about, 23, 24 years old at the time, had recently married, and Luther wants him teaching the Bible, not only at the university where he's been active teaching, of course, with Greek, and he's had some training. I think by this time he's taken the degree, the first degree in theology, the Bachelor of Bible degree. But in this letter of September 1521, Luther writes to Spalatin and says, Melanchthon should be called to be teaching in the town amongst the people. And he knows that Melanchthon can't be ordained. He's by a bishop. No bishop is going to ordain a married man. But Luther sees, and this is the beginning of his articulating how he understands the ministry. What makes a minister is not an ordination by a bishop, but the call of the congregation. And certainly ordination will come as a practice among Lutherans also. But it's the call of the congregation that Luther wants arranged for Melanchthon, so that he will be active not just among the students, but in the town, teaching the evangelical message. He also responds to Karlstadt's theses on clerical celibacy and grows very concerned. Oh, I don't like this idea of saying it's a sin if you don't leave the monastery, or looking at clerical celibacy as so bad that it's a sin not to It's a sin if you don't get married, etc. So he writes, no, we need a much stronger argument based on Scripture than what Karlstadt is appearing to be giving, because he doesn't want to see people make decisions and then have a guilty conscience over breaking their vows, etc. So he's active through his correspondence, even as his colleagues are beginning to take action in things in Wittenberg and elsewhere. Also during this time, by the spring or by the fall and into the next year, Luther begins publishing some devotional commentaries in German. He writes a series of, I think it's his Psalm 36 commentary, which comes out first, and it's based on the lectionary readings right after Easter, and uses them to communicate an evangelical message. Then publishes one on Psalm 67. These are the Latin Vulgate numbers, and our numbers are different. And also in this time, a German commentary on the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. All of these conveying in the German language, very accessible to people, his very important insights theologically. And these devotional works were printed in Germany. I'll have to turn and look because my notes don't have this material here. They quickly made their way throughout the towns of Germany, so that, for example, by that September, in a town called Brunswick or Braunschweig, Lower Saxony, outside the Elector Frederick's territory, there's a letter from a merchant by the name of Hans Pelt, very active in the trade toward the North Sea area, who writes to another early disciple of Martin Luther, Thomas Müntzer, in a letter, and talks about, specifically naming, we have, for our consolation, we have from Martin at the University of Wittenberg his commentaries on Psalm 36 and 37 and a fine piece on the Magnificat. So, though Luther's not at Wittenberg, he's active in his exile in the Wartburg. These publications are coming from the press in Wittenberg and making their way very quickly throughout the towns of Germany. And it's interesting, the theme of these commentaries is comfort in the midst of opposition, persecution, suffering. And he has a theme in some of these commentaries that comes from the traditions of German mysticism. When you're facing opposition, let go, let go. In other words, let God. You know that phrase sometimes used today, let go and let God. Don't allow yourself to go through the suffering or struggles of this life, knowing that God will work in them, through them in your life spiritually. And this Hans Pelt, a layman, is writing about these to this other young priest, Thomas Müntzer, conveying how this is of great comfort to him, and a circle of lay people that are active in this town of Braunschweig. If we can move to the next slide. Also, while he's in his exile, Luther writes several major treatises. He writes one on confession, the practice and even requirement that people confess their sins to a priest, and again is engaging the ideas, what is an evangelical manner of dealing with sin and sharing the gospel. He writes a very important treatise called Against Latimus, where he talks about some of the academic issues in his theology. So he's still active in that same way, essentially as a professional theologian. But most of his writings are much more directed toward the people and toward preachers that are beginning to hold on to his message and implement it in their own preaching. He writes a treatise, a very important one, on the misuse of the Mass. And as we'll learn, how to deal with the Mass, the major sacramental service of the Roman Church, and how to reform the Mass. And very importantly, by November, he has completed, and I think it's the following January or February that it's published, a book on monastic vows. Actually, it's titled The Judgment of Dr. Martin Luther on Monastic Vows, where he gives his answer to celibacy and the traditions of monasticism as he's developed them in a different way than his colleague Karlstadt had done the previous fall, or the previous summer, I think it was. Very interestingly, a theological work will often have a letter of dedication or a preface. And very interestingly, Luther, as the preface to his book on monastic vows, writes in Latin a very personal letter to his father, Hans. Now, there's no way Hans knew any Latin. He probably couldn't even read, although as a copper miner and entrepreneur, perhaps he could read some. But it's very interesting that in this very personal letter, very self-revealing letter about Luther and his relationship with his father, he talks about how his father, it was in disobedience to his father that he had entered the monastery, remember. And his father was very angry about that. When he was ordained a priest, his father came and even presented him with a very important gift. But when Luther talked with his father right after his saying of the Mass, his father blurted out, "How do you know that vow wasn't from the devil?" And so there was this conflict. And Luther writes very personally about this conflict in this letter that obviously was meant to be very public. It was the preface to this book. Well, why? Because it served the function. Luther in this letter explains that he came to criticize and eventually reject the idea of monastic vows from experience. He had been a monk, he had been an excellent monk, an exemplary monk. He says to his father, we delighted in our monkery. But he came to the conviction that it was against God's will that he went into the monastery in a sense, because it was breaking the commandment, honor your father and mother, by disobeying his father. But at the same time, he said, God had a purpose in that I might experience this life and essentially come to reject it from that experience. And so his book on monastic vows is not his personal renouncing of them. He continues after his exile, takes again the tonsure, the haircut of the monk, the cowl, the robe of the monk, continues to be Friar Martin Luther for at least several years, until 1524, we believe. And doesn't certainly end the monastic life until he himself gets married in 1525, as we'll come to know. But in this book, Judgment of Dr. Martin Luther on Monastic Vows, he says that no vow like this can be binding, because it undermines God's own commands. God's command of marriage, God's command for family life, God's command to be in the world and serving one's neighbor, etc. As he continued, we'll move on to the next one. Luther began to work with the scriptures. He wrote a lot of sermons and published them. He published what became known as his church postil, and this first edition of it called the Wartburg postil, because it was published here, a series of sermons on Advent and Christmas lectionary readings that every pastor used, just as we still use today, for the Sunday services. And the postil comes from a Latin word after these words, postia, which was a tradition that with the biblical text could be words of commentary on the text, postils. And he wrote his Wartburg postil as essentially sermon sermon points or sermon guidance for the lectionary readings. Just as pastors today, when they're preparing their sermons, might use pulpit helps of some kind, that's what Luther did with these sermons. Yes, they could even be preached just as they were, but they're more sermon studies than they were sermons in their own right. Then he published, very importantly, a translation of the whole New Testament. And this is a remarkable thing, that apparently within about 6 to 8 weeks, he got the bulk of translating from the Greek edition that Erasmus had published, a second edition in 1519. Luther using Erasmus's Greek text, Erasmus's translation of the Latin text, or translation of the Greek into Latin, together with the traditional Vulgate Latin, and translates anew, using the Greek text into German. It's not the first translation of the Bible into German, but it was undeniably the most successful. And the fact that he accomplishes this in a matter of weeks and several months as it was finalized is really remarkable. It takes a while, of course, to come to publication, and it's not published till the following September, after Luther's back in Wittenberg. And so it's known as the September Testament, 1522. Let's go to the, it has a, well, maybe back just a second. It has a rather hard to read but very decorative title page, as you can see. The New New Testament Deutsch, the New Testament in German, with Wittenberg. And then on the next page, I just gave you an idea of how this appeared. This is the books of the New Testament. Just 23 of them, numbered, almost in the order we have them today, but not quite. Interestingly, indented at the bottom and not numbered are 4 books: the Epistle to the Hebrews, the Epistle of James, or Jacob as they say in German, the Epistle of Jude, and the Revelation of John. Very visibly distinguishing those books from the other books of the New Testament. We'll get at why in just a moment. In his New Testament, Luther presented tools for understanding the text. He begins with a preface. And in this preface, he says, actually, there shouldn't be anything together with the Bible. You should just be confronted with the Word of God. But because there's so many misdirections on how to understand the Bible, we need to have a preface. We need to give some guidance. And he begins to explore what the New Testament is in this preface. Says things like, we have 4 Gospels, but really there's not 4 Gospels. There's one Gospel, one urgent message, as he calls it, that needs to be preached. So in his preface, in the later editions, when the whole Bible came out in German, it became known as the Preface to the New Testament. But in these first editions, where just the New Testament was gathered, it simply was called Preface. Then, within that preface, he also explains the distinction of law and gospel. That's so essential to his theology by this point, and henceforth. The relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. All of this nicely, compactly presented in his preface. Toward the end of this preface, he has a section. How one should make judgments about these books of the New Testament. He says that of all the Gospels, John's Gospel is the most important. And he says in an interesting way why he has this opinion. That the other Gospels talk a lot about the works of Jesus, his miracles, his serving his people, but less about his teaching than John's Gospel, which is so rich in recording the discourses of Jesus. He says, well, the works of Jesus are important, but the words of Jesus are much more important for us. An interesting way of looking at the Gospels. Focusing on their message. Then he emphasizes that Paul's epistles are very, very important, and among them especially the epistle to the Romans, which he calls later the key to understanding the whole Bible. The epistle to the Galatians and the Ephesians. And next to these, the first epistle of Peter he mentions as very important. And he summarizes his view as these are the books which show Christ to you. Most of the individual books, the Gospels are just covered after that first preface, but then Before most of the individual books, Luther includes a preface talking about the content of these books. And the one to Romans is quite long. It actually details the whole structure and outline of the book of Romans, what the argument of the book of Romans is. And really, it's one of the most important sources of Luther for understanding his grasp of the gospel, his understanding of what the gospel is and its power in the life of a Christian. When one thinks that of all the writings of Luther, the Bible translated was the most often read, the most often used, the fact that these prefaces appeared from this first edition onward shows that they were probably the most accessed of all of Luther's writings in his time and since. And let me just read a little bit from his preface to the Romans to give a grasp of how he views faith and the gospel. He begins the preface with these words: "This epistle is in truth the most important document in the New Testament, the gospel in its purest expression." As I mentioned, it becomes the key to illumine the whole Bible, as he says. But listen especially to how he talks about faith. In a section after distinguishing the law of God from the gospel or the gifts of God, he says, faith is something that God effects in us. It changes us and we are reborn from God, John 1. Faith puts the old Adam to death and makes us quite different men in heart, in mind, and in all our powers. And it is accompanied by the Holy Spirit. Oh, when it comes to faith, what a living, creative, active, powerful thing it is. It cannot do other than good at all times. It never waits to ask whether there is some good work to do. Rather, before the question is raised, it has done the deed and keeps on doing it. A man not active in this way is a man without faith. He is groping about for faith and searching for good works, but knows neither what faith nor what good works are. Nevertheless, he keeps on talking nonsense about faith and good works. Faith is a living and unshakable confidence, a belief in the grace of God so assured that a man would die 1,000 deaths for its sake. This kind of confidence in God's grace, this sort of knowledge of it, makes us joyful, high-spirited, and eager in our relations with God and with all mankind. Just a piece of a really powerful way of describing Christian life and faith as the center of Christian life, because faith itself is the work of God in the Christian. The last section of his preface to the New Testament, interestingly, raised the question about certain books that from the early times, as he said, were disputed as to their role. Who authored them, for example, or what do they have the same character as the apostolic works of the New Testament? And he mentions these by name. Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation are books that he has questions about. He says of James that compared with these important books like the John's Gospel and the Epistle to Romans, etc., James is like an epistle full of straw. And later he has a preface to James and Jude together. And he said, I like the book of James. It's an important book because it gives us God's laws, not the laws of men. But there's nothing about Jesus and the cross in the book of James. It's a very practical book, but it's not a book really conveying the gospel, or at least conveying the work of Christ for our redemption in a clear way. This is Luther's opinion. And it's interesting that right away in these first editions, these statements reevaluating the books of the New Testament are conveyed in a clear way. Next slide shows us that some of the New Testament, already in its first edition, had some illustrations by Luther's friend, Lucas Cranach. Characteristically, most of the illustrations come with the book of Revelation. A book that Luther says he struggles with because it seems like such a threatening Christ, a judgmental Christ in a way. Later, by the way, Luther comes to a deeper appreciation for the book of Revelation. But amongst the prophecies of Revelation include talk about the whore of Babylon and the beast out of the sea and the beast of the earth that come and oppress the church of God. And very interestingly, in the illustration of this first edition, the woman, the whore of Babylon on the monstrous beast, is wearing the papal crown called the tiara. So a very graphic portrayal of Luther's rejection of the Roman leagues. Already in the second edition, known as the December Testament, because it was published that following December, just a few months later, the first edition had gone out of print already. Sold out. Already in the December edition, that crown is changed to a simple crown. So already there was this sense that Luther's just a little bit too well, as he said it himself in his speech at Worms, sometimes in attacking persons I have been too harsh. And so that was an indication that some of these statements, even in his New Testament, or the way they were portrayed, could be controversial. Maybe we have one or two more slides. I don't know. Yeah, so he also published some other works during this time. An introduction to the Wartburg Apostle, these sermon helps, was called A Brief Instruction on What to Look For and Expect in the Gospels. And here he says, the chief article and foundation of the gospel is that before you take Christ as an example, you accept and recognize him as a gift, a present that God has given you and that is your own. Christ himself, with his deeds and sufferings, belongs to you. This is the great fire of the love of God for us, whereby the heart and conscience become happy, secure, and content. This is what preaching the Christian faith means. So this is how the Reformation really began. Luther, from exile, writing such works, publishing such works that conveyed his ideas of the gospel and began very rapidly to spread throughout Germany and indeed all of Europe. So we will now take our break.